This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
For JRPG fans, the SNES era is widely considered to be the genre's golden age. While some, myself included, retain a soft spot for the PlayStation era, the supremacy of the fourth generation is so widespread that it's nearly taken on the status of a self-evident truth. And, to be fair, it's not hard to see why so many are in agreement here. I'm going to list off a short handful of games. Chrono Trigger, Trials of Mana, Secret of Evermore, Romancing Saga 3, Bahamut Lagoon, Front Mission Gun Hazard, and Super Mario RPG. These are all fantastic games, some rank among the all-time greatest in the history of the genre, and every single one of them came from one company, Squaresoft of course, and were released within the span of a year. If there was ever a period that could appropriately be described as an embarrassment of riches, this is it. But there's a downside to these eras as well. With so many genre-defining titles released in so short a time, many are inevitably going to be left by the wayside. You can have an incredible game on your hands, but if your contemporaries are Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI, you're probably not going to retain top-of-mind awareness, unfair as that may be. And that's a shame, because there are multitudes of great games languishing in obscurity that don't deserve such a fate. And in certain instances, this can befall not just individual games, but entire developers. And I can think of no better example of this phenomenon in action than Quintet. If you're watching this, you're probably of one of two minds regarding Quintet. Either you're completely unfamiliar with their work, or you're a diehard superfan. I've encountered very few who are anywhere in between. This makes sense, in a way. Even in their prime, while their games generally performed well, they were never blockbusters, and today, with one important exception that I'll get to later, their games have fallen out of fan consciousness, a fate that can be blamed, in major part, on the fact that those games have received no legitimate re-releases since they initially came out in the 1990s. And yet, despite this crippling inaccessibility, Quintet still retains a cult following that can only be described as rabid. For those who have played them, their games are considered to be among the most memorable, indeed perhaps the greatest, of their generation. Despite this, I still believe Quintet's work can benefit from some additional attention, and so here I am. This is going to be an ongoing, multi-part series examining Quintet's games, discussing both the history of the studio and analyzing their major works, with a heavy emphasis on the common themes that reoccur throughout their catalog. Regardless of which of those two camps you're in, diehard superfan or complete novice, I hope that this series will help you appreciate what is undoubtedly one of the most singularly great action RPG developers to ever work in the medium. Now, to better understand Quintet's place in history, we need to go back several years before their foundation, specifically to December 10th, 1984. Miami Vice was dominating the airwaves, What's Love Got to Do With It was topping the charts, and over in Japan, PC game developer Nihon Falcom released a little game called Dragon Slayer. The importance of Dragon Slayer to the history of video games cannot be understated. At the time, RPGs were still in their infancy. Ultima and Wizardry, long considered to be the genre's two most defining titles, had only come out in 1981, and The Dragon and the Princess, arguably the earliest RPG made by a Japanese developer, had only released in 1982. Obviously, this meant that many of the genre's tropes and conventions had yet to be codified. Despite this, what these early games had in common was a turn-based battle system, echoing the tabletop RPGs that were their biggest source of inspiration. Dragon Slayer changed all that. Instead of being turn-based, combat played out in real time. Now, it must be said, there's some debate as to what actually was the first game to make this quantum leap forward. Some argue that the Tower of Jiraga or Hydlide, both of which also released in 1984, are more deserving of that honor. Despite this, the common consensus, at least as I understand it, is that Dragon Slayer lays claim to the title of being the first action RPG ever made. The game was a success, but its sequel, 1985's Xanadu, became a bona fide phenomenon. Xanadu sold over 400,000 copies, which ranked it among the best-selling PC games in Japan for over a decade. Furthermore, as Falcom's founder Masayuki Kato later admitted, if one were to take pirated copies into consideration, then every PC owner in Japan probably had a copy of Xanadu in their collection. So, now that Dragon Slayer and Xanadu had set the template for early action RPGs, what was that template like? First, the stories in these games were minimal. Dragon Slayer was called that because the story was entirely centered around slaying a dragon. Most of the effort was spent on the action-centric gameplay, and that gameplay was tough. Insanely tough. In Xanadu's case, it was so tough that Falcom actually gave out rewards to anyone who managed to finish the game, and make no mistake, very few were able to do that. While this story-light, difficulty-heavy approach wasn't inherently harmful to the genre, the sales numbers from the time don't lie, after all, it nevertheless probably would have limited their reach in the long term. If action RPGs were to grow, there needed to be some sort of alternative coexisting alongside them. It's clear that some at Falcom felt exactly the same way, because on June 21st, 1987, they released a game that would shift the paradigm of action RPGs from that day forward. Much like Dragon Slayer before it, the importance of Ys to the history of video games cannot be overstated. Sure, it didn't establish the templates of its genre in the same way Dragon Slayer did, but its impact is no less palpable. To state the most obvious, as of this recording, the Ys series is the second longest running RPG franchise still in active development, second only, I should add, to the mighty Dragon Quest. But it's far more than just that. Like I said, other action RPGs were light on story, and even the turn-based RPGs of the day were still mostly in their kill the dragon, rescue the princess phase. Ys was different. While admittedly simplistic by modern standards, the story of Adol's quest to discover and destroy the ancient evil plaguing the land of Asteria was light years more advanced than most of its contemporaries. This is even more true if one takes into consideration the material found in the game's manual, which contains far more of Adol's backstory than was able to fit in the game itself. The argument can very easily be made that the story of Ys was the most complex in an RPG up to that point. It was so complex, in fact, that it was too large to be told in a single game, necessitating the release of a sequel the following year. The gameplay was a similar departure from other action RPGs. Far from being borderline impossible, Ys featured a battle system that literally anyone could pick up. You literally bump into enemies to damage them. This is not to say that the game was a cakewalk, as it provided its fair share of challenge, especially in the boss battles. Nevertheless, when compared to games like Xanadu, the difference was like night and day. Rather than describing it as easy, I'd say that Ys is better described as accessible. It's almost as if the creators of Ys 1 and 2 went out of their way to make something that was specifically designed to fill the void that games like Dragon Slayer could not satisfy. So, who exactly were they? The game was primarily the brainchild of two men, director and programmer Masaya Hashimoto, and scenario writer Tomoyoshi Miyazaki. I'll start with Hashimoto, the man most responsible for its accessible gameplay. He joined Falcom in 1986, working on the expansion pack to Xanadu, Xanadu Scenario 2, and Azteca 2, The Temple of the Sun. A 1987 interview reveals him to be quite the hardcore gamer, admitting to the interviewer that he had recently beat Simon's Quest and Xanadu, and was fanatical about Darius. This passion for games inevitably led him to develop a deep understanding of what their audiences were probably looking for. To quote him directly, "Recent RPGs have been very difficult, and it takes a lot of willpower to finish them. So eventually we came to have our doubts. Was this game really fun? With Ys, therefore, we set out to create the opposite kind of game, something that would be accessible, easy to play, and not geared towards hardcore RPG maniacs. From that mindset was born the bump combat system, as well as other forward-thinking design choices including the ability to save anywhere and a reduced need for grinding. And it's obvious that Hashimoto wanted potential players to understand this from the outset. Advertisements for the time declared that with Ys, RPGs were entering an age of kindness. Now let's turn to Miyazaki, the man most responsible for Ys's ambitious story. Like Hashimoto, he joined Falcom in 1986 and worked on Azteca 2 and Xanadu Scenario 2, and also, like Hashimoto, was a gamer himself. He had been playing tabletop RPGs and going to game centers for years, and even learned coding to improve the games he was playing in his spare time. But something new Miyazaki brought to the table was a bona fide passion for storytelling. Indeed, earlier in his life, he actually intended to become a writer of children's books. He brought that authorial mindset with him to Falcom. With Ys, he wanted to gradually uncover the history of the lost continent of Ys, as well as to emphasize themes of human nature and trust. This partnership of Hashimoto and Miyazaki clearly hit on something special, as Ys quickly became the signature series in Falcom's library. The memorable characters, including the red-haired adventurer Adol, Dogi the Wall Crusher, and the beautiful Lilia, captured fans' imaginations, and Falcom fed those imaginations by marketing them like crazy. The games would also end up basically becoming the Skyrim of their day, being ported to what seemed like every computer and console currently available. Hashimoto and Miyazaki had created another phenomenon for Nihon Falcom. Their star was clearly in ascendance, and it seemed only a matter of time before the duo would grace the world with a third Ys game. The world would only have to wait another year for Ys 3. However, little was anyone aware at the time that it was precisely this game that would cause Hashimoto and Miyazaki to sever their ties with Falcom forever. Development on Ys 3 began in somewhat of a roundabout way. Beginning in July of 1988, 3 months after the release of Ys 2, the game was, initially, going to be a completely new IP, not related to the Ys series at all. However, at some point in development, Adol was used as a placeholder for the main character. This ended up sticking, and the team decided to retool the game into the third entry in the Ys series. Despite this, it would seem that Hashimoto and Miyazaki intended Ys 3 to be less of a sequel and more of a side story. Indeed, the working title of the game was not even Ys 3, but Adol's Great Adventure, and then later, Wanderers from Ys, which ended up becoming its subtitle. Looking at the game itself further emphasizes this. Though it is admittedly titled Ys 3 in the opening scene, the front cover does not show a number at all. I don't think the team intended to de-emphasize its continuity out of any sense of shame. Miyazaki, in fact, called the game his representative work in a 1989 interview. Rather, I think the point was to let players know that they shouldn't expect the same experience they found in Ys 1 and 2. After all, the story of the Land of Ys was fully wrapped up at the end of Ys 2, and as if that weren't enough, I mean, just look at it. No bump combat, no overhead view, it's a side-scroller, compared by all who've played it to Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. This is not a coincidence. Hashimoto was playing a lot of Zelda 2, as well as the first 2 Castlevania games, during Ys 3's development, and went out of his way to incorporate aspects of their design into his game. This drawing from the console game well actually provides insight into the reason why Hashimoto and Miyazaki would end up leaving the company. At the time, Falcom was, first and foremost, a PC game developer. Yes, their games tended to be ported to consoles, but these versions were done by outside developers, not Falcom themselves. In fact, save for one single exception, Dragon Slayer 4, The Drossel Family, which would be released in the West as Legacy of the Wizard, Falcom did not develop any console games at all. In fact, this developmental conservatism was even more extreme than that. Falcom confined themselves to develop for one PC company only, NEC, for their PC-88 and PC-98 computers. Now, exact details are fuzzy, but according to Hiromasa Iwasaki, the director of Ys 1 and 2's excellent PC Engine port, at some point during development, the relationship between Hashimoto and Falcom's upper management drastically deteriorated. The reason why was not stated, but based on context clues, Hashimoto's console game influences and Falcom's ultra-conservative management style, it's likely that Hashimoto probably wanted Falcom to focus more on console development, and his suggestions were pushed back by management. This becomes even more likely when we consider that this exact scenario would happen to other Falcom employees as well. Consider, in the early 90s, Yoshio Kiya, the director of the Dragon Slayer franchise, approached Falcom's president Masayuki Kato and tried to convince him to develop games for Windows PCs. Not only did Kato deny the request, he said that if they began developing for Windows PCs, it would ruin the company. If Falcom couldn't be convinced, in the early 90s, to develop for one additional PC platform by the man who basically made their company into a success, then there's no way, in the late 80s, they would even consider Hashimoto's suggestion to flirt with console development. And so, faced with a corporate culture that seemed to entirely discount his reasonable suggestions for growth, Hashimoto did the only thing he felt that he could do. In March of 1989, he left Falcom entirely. His departure was, in fact, a smaller part of an ongoing mass exodus of talent from Falcom, who all left for reasons related to feeling undervalued and underappreciated. This included director Kazunari Tomy, who went on to form Studio Alex, co-developers of the Lunar franchise, and graphic designer Tetsuya Takahashi, who joined Squaresoft's nascent Final Fantasy team before becoming an important developer in his own right. And yes, I am talking about that Tetsuya Takahashi. But the loss of Hashimoto, the man who shepherded Falcom's most successful franchise since Dragon Slayer, must have seemed like a killing blow, made that much worse by the fact that he did not leave empty-handed. He took his partner Miyazaki with him, as well as several other veterans of the East development team, including graphic designer Koji Yokota and scenario writer Reiko Takabayashi. Hashimoto and Miyazaki wasted no time attempting to do what Falcom denied them. In April 1989, only a month after leaving Falcom, they incorporated their new company, Quintet. The name Quintet was in reference to the 5 pivotal aspects of game development: programming, planning, graphics, sound, and production, and the studio intended to make their mark in perhaps the most ambitious way possible. Setting their sights on Nintendo's not-yet-released Super Famicom, whose development was announced 2 years earlier, their initial project was intended to be an RPG that would depict the entire life cycle of a planet. By all accounts, development was going well, but shockingly, when the game was 70% complete, Quintet decided to completely abandon it. Their thinking was that a standard RPG, regardless of how ambitious in scope, was not deserving of their first entry on the Super Famicom. In the words of Miyazaki himself, if we're going to develop for the Super Famicom, we've got to do something super. Super, in this case, meant taking advantage of the Super Famicom's hardware, allowing them to experiment with graphical rotation and enlargement, advanced scrolling, and more elaborate soundscapes. This new game would enter development under the name Sacred Master, later changing to the World Master. By the end of 1990, the game was ready to be released, with Quintet finding a long-term publishing partner in Enix, the legendary owner of the Dragon Quest franchise. In December of that year, the game finally dropped under yet another new name, ActRaiser. The plot of ActRaiser is almost mythic in scope. Long ago, the world was governed by a deity called the Master, who in time was threatened by an evil being called Tanzra. Tanzra's goal was to destroy the Master and take over his world, which he was unable to do. However, after summoning his 6 guardians to assist him, the Master became badly injured, retreating to his sky palace and falling into a deep slumber in an attempt to heal his wounds. With the Master in hibernation, the world fell to Tanzra's forces. He divided the world into 6 regions, each ruled by one of his 6 guardians. The people of that world gradually forgot the Master, with the only trace of his existence being a series of statues scattered across the land. Years later, with his strength restored, the Master began to plot to free the world from Tanzra's dominion. So that's ActRaiser's story, a Manichaean struggle of light against darkness, with the fate of the world at stake. It's a basic setup, sure, but don't let that fool you. The game is, even 30 plus years after its release, one of the most novel games I've ever played. If you know anything about ActRaiser, it's the fact that the game is divided into 2 very different portions, action mode and simulation mode. I'm going to start with action mode. After an introduction in the Sky Palace, you're transported down to the region of Fillmore, a scene which utilizes the Super Famicom's super rotational capabilities. Once in Fillmore, you take control of one of those statues I mentioned, at which point you try and accomplish the goal of every action platformer, Move to the right, kill everything in your path until you reach the boss, and then kill him too. It's a system anyone who's played a Castlevania game will be familiar with. No doubt the result of Hashimoto being a fan of that franchise, especially considering one of the bosses seems way too similar to Dracula to be a coincidence. But don't be fooled. Just because ActRaiser is taking obvious inspiration from Castlevania, that doesn't mean it's a carbon copy. First of all, Hashimoto clearly applied the same philosophy he used when developing Ys and used it again for ActRaiser. Castlevania is one of those series that seems to take endless delight in beating the player down. Oh, I can't hit the enemy. Oh, got knocked into a pit. Oh, the fucking Medusa heads. This isn't a slight against Castlevania. I love that series to death. But just as I wouldn't want every action RPG to be a Xanadu, I wouldn't want every action platformer to be a Castlevania. Sometimes I like playing games that I don't have to replay 50 times to win, and ActRaiser more than fills that need. Again, like Ys, this doesn't mean it's an easy game. I've always been challenged by 2D action platformers, and this is no exception to that, but it's undeniably more accessible than Castlevania. The Master's Sword is far more intuitive and simpler than Simon Belmont's whip. There's plenty of opportunities for you to recover your health. You don't have to worry about finding bonus abilities in the levels themselves. You equip your magic in the Sky Palace, and then you use that spell for the entire level. Finally, ActRaiser's enemies are, to me at least, not as difficult to kill, and here's the kicker, getting hit by one doesn't send you flying backwards into an oftentimes deadly fall. Now to move on to some presentational stuff. Of course, there are more impressive looking games on the SNES. The game came out so early in its life that it's basically a launch title. But remember, Quintet was a brand new studio, working on brand new hardware, and given all that, the game looks great for its age. The fact that the game's levels are scattered all throughout the world gives it access to a variety far beyond what Castlevania, which was by necessity limited by its universal movie monster-inspired setting, could possibly imagine. Forests, tombs, jungles, ice caverns, whatever geographical setting you can imagine, it's probably in this game. This impressive variety is enhanced by the game's soundtrack, which deserves an entire section of its own because, honestly, it's that important. ActRaiser's soundtrack was written by Yuzo Koshiro, one of the most influential and well-respected composers in the entire medium. Hashimoto and Miyazaki had known Koshiro since their days at Falcom, as he was yet another who had joined the company during production of Xanadu Scenario 2. After becoming one of the de facto composers for the Dragon Slayer series, notably contributing to the soundtracks of both Legacy of the Wizard and Sorcerian, those East soundtracks would be considered by many as some of the greatest in the history of video games, and as a primary reason for why Falcom has historically placed so much focus on the music in their games. Alas, Koshiro suffered the same fate as many of his compatriots at Falcom. After what appears to have stemmed from disagreements over the copyright of his compositions, Koshiro left Falcom in 1988. His sister Ayano, who was herself a gifted graphic designer on the East team, chose to leave with him. Thereafter, he continued composing on a freelance basis, most notably working on the 1989 Sega Genesis hack-and-slash classic, The Revenge of Shinobi. Given Hashimoto and Miyazaki's previous relationship with him, Koshiro must have seemed like the obvious choice for ActRaiser. Once tapped, Koshiro was not about to simply repeat what he had already done for Ys or The Revenge of Shinobi. The Super Famicom's hardware had made it theoretically possible for him to compose a soundtrack that would sound genuinely orchestral, and he was dead set on making that happen. He actually convinced Hashimoto to create a new sound driver to accomplish that, and Hashimoto, being the stand-up guy and gifted programmer that he is, actually did it for him. To repeat something I've already said twice in this very video, it's impossible to overstate how important ActRaiser's soundtrack is to the history of video game music. Granted, composers like Final Fantasy's Nobuo Uematsu and Dragon Quest's Koichi Sugiyama had already crafted compositions that were inspired by the classical tradition, but there was only so much you could do with those compositions using 8-bit console architecture. If you wanted to hear the way the opening to Dragon Quest was meant to be heard, you wouldn't turn on your NES, you'd put on your Symphonic Suite Dragon Quest albums and listen to those. The release of the SNES would change all that. Let me give you a better idea of just how much the paradigm shifted with the release of ActRaiser's soundtrack. Here's a song from Final Fantasy III, released only a few months before ActRaiser. In contrast, here's a song from ActRaiser. To modern ears, the jump in quality is apparent, but to the ears of gamers in the early 90s, this must have sounded nothing short of a revelation. Indeed, no less an authority on video game music as Yasunori Mitsuda himself said that every developer in the industry was impacted after they heard how symphonic ActRaiser's soundtrack sounded. A well-known legend said that even Nobuo Uematsu decided to rework the soundtrack for the then-in-development Final Fantasy IV in response to Koshiro's work. And while I don't know of a direct source that quotes Uematsu admitting this, it's a legend that I'm inclined to believe. Mitsuda himself repeated this story, and Mitsuda worked with Uematsu directly. Now, I've been focusing mainly on the soundtrack's classical credentials, but make no mistake, there's far more variety than just classical compositions. I have to give Koshiro credit for including a couple songs that appear to emphasize an unsettling atmosphere, in spite of it seeming like it would be inappropriate in an action-heavy setting. And of course, since this is a Koshiro soundtrack, there's plenty of catchy, upbeat tracks as well. The theme for Fillmore is held in particularly high esteem, but I also personally love the music for Kasandora. In all, yeah, there's very good reason why this soundtrack is so well remembered. It's absolutely essential listening for anyone who's even remotely interested in video game music. Now, I've spent plenty of time heaping praise on its action sequences, its graphics, and its soundtrack, but I've yet to touch on the most unique aspect of ActRaiser. So let's change that and talk about simulation mode. Once you've cleared a region of Tanzra's demons, your next goal is to create a world for your people to live in peace and prosperity. That's what simulation mode is. It's a straight-up God sim, which is incredibly forward-thinking considering that Populous, the game that more or less created the modern God sim, only released the previous year. In fact, to the surprise of nobody, the sim mode borrows a lot from Populous. Like in that game, you start in the wilderness with your followers in the single digits, and it's your job to grow your population and, by extension, the civilization level of the world. This is, admittedly, fairly simple to do. Basically, you guide the people in the direction in which they're to expand, and it happens automatically. Sure, there is a timer you have to contend with, your people can only do so much at one time after all, but all you have to do is wait for it to refill and they'll start building again automatically. In addition to simply building this new world, you'll also, on occasion, have to tame the landscape to ensure that human beings can exist there comfortably. Being a god, you have a multitude of miracles at your disposal to make this happen. Everything from sunlight to melt snow, lightning to destroy trees and rocks, and rain to, well, make it rain. Of course, Tanzra isn't going to sit quietly while you reclaim your world. He sends more demons to kill your villagers and destroy your cities, and in order to make any meaningful progress, you have to not only kill them, but seal the portals that create them. Again, this is simple enough. You just guide your people to the portals and they'll seal them on their own. And you kill the demons by attacking them with arrows. The demons will, of course, try and kill you in return, but no worries, you actually can't die in sim mode. Losing all your health just means that you'll temporarily be unable to attack. Since we're talking about the demons, I probably should take a minute to address an issue I had with these simulation segments. The graphics. Compared to the visuals of the action sections, the look of the simulation sections is simplistic. I argue simplistic to a fault. The demons in particular look cartoony, even cutesy, which made it impossible for me to take them seriously. I understand that much of this is simply a product of its age. I mean, I don't think Populous's visuals have aged particularly well either. Aside from that one criticism, I found these sim sections to be satisfying. Nobody is going to try and argue that they're particularly deep, and some people may hold that in lesser esteem because of it. Honestly, I've never thought that was fair, as creating a populous killer was, in my eyes, never Quintet's end goal. Now, gaming has a number of well-known auteur directors, Hideo Kojima perhaps being the most prominent, whose vision is so singularly powerful that their mark is felt on everything they create. Quintet, I argue, is an example of an auteur studio. As we'll see in subsequent videos in this series, their major work is obsessed with a few key themes, notably with the creation and destruction of life on an almost cosmic scale. And ActRaiser, even at this early stage in their history, is a vivid example of this obsession in action. The Master, being a divine figure, is an agent of creation, and creation by necessity means maintaining a world where the flourishing of life is fostered and maintained. This, paradoxically, requires a certain amount of destruction, something most obviously seen in the game's action sections. For as much iconography as it draws from the Judeo-Christian tradition, ActRaiser's action sections also seem to draw heavily from the classical heroic tradition. Think Apollo slaying Python, Perseus slaying Medusa, and so on, where the founder of a great civilization must destroy some primeval force before that civilization can thrive. Mankind can apparently not coexist with these primeval forces, as they seem literally hell-bent on wiping out anything that impedes their territory. This carries over to the sim sections, too. You have to wipe out the monsters and seal all their layers, after all, but it's more than just that. The quickest way to upgrade a city's civilization level, for instance, is to use the Earthquake Miracle, which levels every single low-level building, forcing the surviving population to rebuild with higher quality materials. This is perhaps the most on-the-nose way of suggesting that the old world must be abandoned if a new, better one is to be born. And make no mistake, the creation of a better world is your only goal, and this occurs in a startlingly disparate number of ways. We've talked about some of them already, but it should also be emphasized that much of your role as the Master sees you basically doing nice things for your people. In Bloodpool, you'll be tasked to find Teddy, a missing boy, and in Aitos, you're requested to provide a gale to keep the land's windmills going. Doing these nice things naturally causes your popularity to grow, and your power grows alongside it. The more followers you have, the more health you'll have in the battle sections, as well as occasionally being granted offerings that will further help in the development of your civilization. But of course, if civilization keeps improving, it stands to reason that after a time, the people will be strong enough to take care of themselves without the Master's aid. Sure enough, this is exactly what happens in the end. After an insane boss rush which sees you fighting all 6 of Tanzra's minions, and then Tanzra himself in his lair of Deathheim, the game ends with you peeking inside your shrines, only to find them empty. This is presented in a subtle, melancholic way. Though there are no more worshippers, it may be that the people are in a better state, more able to help themselves instead of relying solely on the Master. It's as if a parent is witnessing their child leaving the nest. In one sense, it's painful and lonely, but in another, it's the best thing for them to continue growing. As you can tell, I love ActRaiser. Not only is it fun to play, but it has a wisdom far beyond what one would expect from what's essentially an SNES launch title. A lot of reviewers describe the game as being quote-unquote greater than the sum of its parts. It may not be as in-depth an action game as Castlevania, or a god game as Populous, but it's worth playing regardless. I can see where they're coming from here, but I always felt that this sells ActRaiser somewhat short. The game has a unity of vision far beyond what one finds in either Castlevania or Populous, and those sorts of comparisons, regardless of how complementary they're meant to be, only serves to diminish what ActRaiser itself has accomplished. It doesn't need its better-known predecessors to validate its own artistic achievements. Thankfully, fans at the time, as well as now, more than recognize those achievements. According to Quintet's official website, ActRaiser sold 600,000 copies worldwide, including an impressive 180,000 copies in the United States alone. It's become Quintet's best-known game, not just because of its unconventional design, but also, much more tragically, because it's the only one of their games, yes, the only one, to ever get any kind of re-release. In 2004, Macrospace ported the game to mobile phones. Unfortunately, it was an atrocious port, considering of only the first 3 action stages, which, from the looks of it, probably controlled like ass. Luckily, in 2007, it received another port, this time to the Wii Virtual Console. Given the Wii's astronomical popularity at the time, as well as the Virtual Console spurring a renewal of interest in retro gaming, this probably did much to re-establish Quintet's standing among modern gamers. Additionally, in 2021, Square Enix partnered with developer Sonic Powered to create ActRaiser Renaissance. This enhanced remake not only retains all the content from the original game, but includes redone graphics, expanded gameplay mechanics in both the action and simulation sections, and a rearranged soundtrack from Yuzo Koshiro himself. This, again, would draw more attention to both ActRaiser and Quintet, with gamers the world over hoping this would be a sign of more re-releases or remakes to come. Sadly, as of this writing, this has not come to pass. No other Quintet game has even been hinted at being re-released or remade, and with the shuttering of the Virtual Console, none of Quintet's original work remains legally available for purchase, with ActRaiser Renaissance being the only game carrying the torch for the studio's legacy. Though this is frustrating, it's no cause for despair. Given the incredible ease of SNES emulation, ActRaiser, and a bunch of Quintet's subsequent work, can be played even on a crappy laptop after downloading a ROM in an emulator. So if you happen to have never played the game before, I implore you to do it now. ActRaiser is not simply a great game in its own right, it's the first sign of more great things to come from Quintet. ActRaiser's themes of restoring the world and all the pain and hardship that comes with it would haunt their subsequent work, and in the next episode, we'll begin to explore that subsequent work.